Two friends, Daniel and Claire, had been driving along the Oregon coast for hours, trying to reach their next stop before nightfall. A heavy storm rolled in faster than expected, and the narrow, twisting highway became slick and dangerous. By the time they checked the GPS, they realized the nearest town was over 30 miles away, and visibility was dropping by the minute. That was when Daniel spotted an old neon sign glowing faintly through the sheets of rain. The letters were cracked, but the words were still visible. Redwood Motel. They decided to stop for the night, telling themselves that a warm bed and a dry roof were better than risking the winding roads in the storm. As they pulled into the small gravel lot, they noticed the place looked far older than the faded sign suggested. The paint was peeling from the wooden panels. Most of the windows were boarded up, and only one flickering bulb lit the front office door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and mildew. An older woman sat behind the counter, her expression unreadable. She slid an old-fashioned key across the counter, saying only that most of the rooms were unavailable due to renovations. She assigned them room 6 without further explanation. When Daniel asked if there was food nearby, the woman didn't answer, only staring at him for a moment before shifting her gaze toward a long, dim hallway behind the lobby. Their room was plain and outdated, with faded wallpaper and a dusty carpet. The lamps buzzed faintly when switched on, and the air carried a strange, earthy dampness, as if the room had been sealed for a long time. Still, it was warm, and after hours on the road, they were grateful. But as the night wore on, things began to feel wrong. Round midnight, Claire woke suddenly, unsure why. The storm outside had calmed, and the silence in the room felt unnatural, thick, heavy, as though the air itself was holding its breath. She noticed Daniel was still asleep, but kept shifting uncomfortably, as though restless. That was when she heard it. A faint knocking sound. It came from the room next door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. She assumed someone else had checked in, though it surprised her. The parking lot had been empty when they arrived. When she sat up and listened more carefully, the knocking started again, followed by a scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. She debated waking Daniel, but decided against it, convincing herself it was just an old building making noise. The next morning, Daniel went to grab coffee from the office. The same woman sat at the desk, motionless, staring at an old ledger book. Daniel mentioned hearing noises from the room next to theirs during the night. Without looking up, the woman said there was no one in that room or any other. Confused, he stepped outside and checked the parking lot again. Their car was still the only one there. When Claire joined him later, she noticed something strange. The door to room 7, the one directly next to theirs, was chained shut from the outside. Faded caution tape still clung to the doorframe, and someone had scrawled across it in black marker, "Do not enter." A cold unease settled over them both. Later that day, while exploring the area, they stopped at a nearby gas station for snacks. When they mentioned staying at the Redwood Motel, the cashier froze for a moment before asking if they were joking. He explained that the motel had been shut down since 1994, after the unexplained disappearance of an entire family staying in room 7, according to locals. No one had stayed there since, at least not anyone who checked out. When Daniel protested, saying they had checked in just the night before, the cashier shook his head and told them the place wasn't open to the public anymore. It was supposed to have been boarded up decades ago. They drove back immediately, but when they arrived, the parking lot was empty. The front office door hung loosely on its hinges, dust coating the inside. The neon sign that had been faintly glowing the night before was dark now, its wires rusted and broken. They returned to room 6, but the door was ajar, and the inside was stripped bare. No bed, no furniture, cracked wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. There was no sign they had ever stayed there at all. Claire pulled out her phone to call the police, but her signal dropped to 0. Daniel tried his as well, but his screen glitched and went black. That was when they noticed something horrifying. The hallway behind them, which had been dimly lit before, now seemed impossibly long, stretching farther than it should have. A soft knock echoed behind them. It came from room 7. Frozen in place, they turned slowly toward the chained door. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it became pounding. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence pressed in on them like a weight. Before either of them could react, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out entirely. For a few seconds, they stood in complete darkness, hearing only their own ragged breathing. When the lights buzzed back to life, the door to room 7 hung wide open, its chains broken on the floor. Inside, the room looked untouched, preserved as if frozen in 1994. Suitcases by the bed, old magazines scattered on the dresser, a half-drunk glass of water by the window, but there were no people. On the far wall, someone had written in large, uneven letters, "You should not be here." Daniel grabbed Claire's hand and they ran. Bursting through the front office door, they reached their car and drove as fast as they could, refusing to look back. Hours later, when they finally reached the next town, they went straight to the police station. But when officers followed them to the Redwood Motel, the lot was overgrown with weeds. The buildings collapsed, the entire place long abandoned. There was no sign of life, but on the passenger seat of their car, Claire found something that hadn't been there before: the old-fashioned brass room key for room 7, cold and damp to the touch. Ethan and Marissa had been on the road for hours, driving through endless stretches of the Arizona desert. Their plan was simple: reach Los Alamos before midnight. But a sudden sandstorm rolled in, thick clouds of dust swallowing the highway and reducing visibility to almost nothing. The GPS rerouted them onto a narrow side road, promising a shortcut, but after 20 miles of winding darkness, they realized there were no streetlights, no signs, and no towns nearby. Then, through the swirling dust, a flickering neon sign appeared on the horizon: Desert View Motel. The building stood alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by jagged rock formations and miles of empty land. The structure was small and outdated, its faded paint peeling beneath years of neglect. Only a single light glowed from the front office window. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp carpet and stale cigarette smoke. A pale, thin clerk sat behind the counter, his posture rigid, his face partially hidden by the brim of an old cap. Without saying much, he slid a tarnished brass key across the desk, assigning them room 105. But just as Ethan reached for the key, the clerk spoke in a low, almost reluctant tone. He warned them never to go near room 103, claiming it had been sealed for everyone's safety. He gave no further explanation, his eyes fixed on the old ledger book in front of him, as if avoiding the subject entirely. Ethan and Marissa exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't press for answers. Their room was basic: a creaky bed, dusty curtains, and an old analog TV that hummed faintly. Outside, the storm raged against the windows, rattling the glass as sand swept across the lot. For a while, they tried to relax, convincing themselves this was just a quick stopover. But sometime after midnight, Ethan stirred awake. At first, he thought the wind had woken him, but then he heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They came from the hallway. He glanced at the clock. 3:03 a.m. The sound came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Marissa stirred as well, whispering in confusion. Then they both froze as they realized exactly where the knocking was coming from. Room 103, just 2 doors down from theirs. They remembered the clerk's warning. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, replaced by an eerie silence. But just when they started to relax, they heard faint scratching sounds against their door, as though something was dragging its fingernails slowly across the wood. Neither of them moved until the sun finally rose. The next morning, Ethan went to the office to return the key and casually asked about room 103. The clerk avoided his gaze and muttered that the room had been locked for over 30 years, and Ethan pressed further. The clerk finally admitted that the last guests who stayed there vanished without a trace in 1992. He said locals believed the room was cursed, that once you stepped inside, didn't come back out the same. Ethan laughed it off as desert folklore, but Marissa felt uneasy. That night, the storm returned, and the motel seemed to sink into an unnatural quiet. Around 3 a.m., the knocking began again. This time, it was louder. Ethan crept to the peephole and glanced into the hallway, expecting to see another guest. But the corridor was empty. And yet, the knocks kept coming, deliberate and steady, as though someone or something stood right in front of room 103's door, hidden just outside his view. Suddenly, the sound stopped, replaced by faint footsteps, pacing back and forth. And then, a whisper. It was low and distorted, like a broken recording, impossible to understand, but filled with urgency. Marissa grabbed Ethan's arm and urged him not to open the door. But he felt drawn to the hallway, as though something was pulling him toward room 103. Against his better judgment, he stepped outside, the old carpet soft beneath his bare feet. The hallway was empty, but when he turned toward room 103, he noticed something strange. The doorknob was moving, slowly, deliberately, as though something inside was trying to turn it from the other side. Suddenly, the hallway light above him flickered, buzzing faintly, before plunging the entire corridor into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud metallic slam echoed from room 103, as though something heavy had thrown itself against the door. Ethan ran back into the room, locking the door behind him. He and Marissa sat frozen in silence until dawn. By morning, they decided to leave, but when they went to return the key, the front desk was empty, the office completely abandoned. Dust covered the counter, and the ledger book was gone. Panic set in as they realized something was terribly wrong. Outside, their car sat where they left it, but the motel's sign had gone dark. The building looked different now, older, more decayed, as though it had been abandoned for decades. The once lit hallways were shattered and filled with debris. And yet, the key in Ethan's hand was cold and damp, freshly used. Before driving away, he glanced back one last time. That was when he saw it. The door to room 103 was wide open, and inside, the room appeared untouched, perfectly preserved, as though someone was still living there. As they pulled out of the lot, Marissa noticed something else. Their names had been scratched into the paint on room 103's door, etched deep into the wood, as though carved long ago. Deep within the dense forests of northern Pennsylvania, 3 friends, Ryan, Claire, and Devin, set out on a weekend hiking trip, hoping to escape the noise of city life. The early autumn air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The woods around them were silent, except for the crunch of dried branches beneath their boots. Ryan had discovered an old, faded map online, one that marked a secluded trail no longer listed on modern hiking apps. At the edge of the route, a strange, handwritten note was scrawled in faded ink. "Do not follow after dark." By the time they reached the unmarked path, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Against better judgment, Ryan insisted they continue, assuring the others that the campsite was only another mile away. But as they pressed deeper into the woods, the trail grew narrow and tangled, swallowed by twisted roots and shadows. Claire began to feel that something was wrong. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no insects, nothing but the occasional whistle of wind brushing through dead branches. After an hour of trudging in near darkness, they came upon something unexpected. Rising from the forest floor like the skeleton of a forgotten past stood an old hotel, its towering wooden frame blanketed in ivy and rot. A cracked sign swung loosely from rusted chains, the letters barely visible. Ashwood Pines Hotel, established 1928. Devin immediately suggested they turn back, but Ryan was drawn to the place. It felt wrong that such a massive structure was hidden deep in the wilderness, untouched by time or vandalism. There were no broken beer bottles, no graffiti, no signs of teenagers exploring. It stood in eerie silence, as if waiting. When they stepped onto the collapsing porch, the air grew colder, and an acrid, musty scent clung to the back of their throats. The massive front doors stood slightly ajar, revealing a dark lobby beyond. Despite their hesitation, Ryan pushed forward, his phone flashlight cutting across a grand, dust-choked reception area. Inside, everything looked strangely preserved. Velvet armchairs sat neatly arranged, an ornate chandelier hung from the ceiling, and a reception bell rested untouched on the front desk. But the strangest part was the guest logbook left open, as if someone had been checking in recently. The last recorded date read, October 17th, 1994, over 30 years ago. Claire whispered that the place gave her the creeps, but Ryan flipped through the log anyway. Every entry listed guests and room numbers till the last few pages. Instead of names, there were scribbles, frantic strokes of ink, symbols, and half-finished sentences. Some were written so violently that the paper had torn. One note stood out. We hear them at night. No one leaves the room after dark. Before anyone could process what that meant, Devin pointed toward a hallway that stretched into darkness. At the far end, a single door stood closed, its brass number plate barely visible. Room 6, from somewhere deep within the hotel. Faint tapping echoed like knuckles against wood, came slowly, rhythmically, and then stopped. The three of them froze. Then, without warning, the sound started again, this time closer. Ryan whispered that it was probably just pipes shifting from old age, but his voice trembled as he said it. They decided to leave, but when they turned back toward the entrance, Claire noticed something unsettling. The front doors were now shut. None of them remembered closing them. Devin tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt ice cold beneath his hands. Ryan suggested they find another way out, and so they began searching for a side door or a broken window. They followed a hallway lined with faded wallpaper, its edges curling like dried skin. Old photographs hung crookedly along the walls, images of smiling guests, K-staff, and families standing in front of a lobby fireplace. But as Claire looked closer, she realized something horrifying. Every photograph had the guests' faces scratched out. She whispered to the others what she'd seen, and the weight of the silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from somewhere upstairs, they heard the faint creak of footsteps. The three friends stared at each other, holding their breath. Devin hissed that the place was supposed to be abandoned. Ryan tried convincing himself it was just the wind, but deep down, none of them believed it. They moved quickly now, nearly running through the hall until they stumbled upon a massive ballroom. Moonlight streamed in from cracked windows, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air. In the center of the room stood a long dining table, still set with tarnished silverware and half-melted candles. Plates were arranged neatly, as if dinner had been interrupted mid-meal decades ago. But what froze them in place was the rotted food on the plates, untouched, yet still there, as though preserved unnaturally by time. Then they saw it. At the far end of the table, an old rotary phone rested on its side. As they approached, it suddenly rang, shrill, sharp, and piercing in the silence. Nobody moved. On the third ring, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint hiss of static coming from somewhere above. Devin looked up at the balcony overlooking the ballroom and swore he saw a shadow moving between the rails. That was when they heard the whispering. It was soft at first, like distant voices, but it quickly grew louder, as though multiple people were speaking over one another. The sound seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Claire grabbed Ryan's arm, trembling, whispering that they needed to leave now. They ran back toward the lobby, but when they turned the corner, their stomachs dropped. The guest logbook, The one Ryan had left open on the desk was now closed, and next to it lay a brass room key. Its tag read, Room 6. Ryan swore he hadn't touched it. None of them had, but now it sat there deliberately, waiting. The tapping returned, louder this time, steady and deliberate, coming from the same hallway as before. It was no longer distant. Something was in the hotel with them. The three of them backed away, their footsteps echoing against the tile, when a sudden crash exploded from upstairs, followed by what sounded like hundreds of feet scurrying across the old floorboards. The noise reverberated through the walls, growing closer. Claire pointed toward a cracked window near the dining area. Without thinking, they smashed the glass with a chair and climbed out into the freezing night air. Branches whipped their faces as they stumbled into the woods, running until the hotel was no longer in sight. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they turned to look back and froze. From deep within the forest, the faint yellow glow of lights flickered in the hotel's windows. Shadows moved inside, pacing back and forth like restless figures trapped in an endless routine. They never spoke about what happened that night, but sometimes when Ryan lies awake in bed, he swears he can still hear the faint sound of tapping, slow, deliberate, and patient, as though Room 6 is still waiting for them to return.